Lukas spends a quiet evening in a home filled with the scent of pine resin and domestic magic. From mindful rituals with Farrah to Balthazar's resonant storytelling by the hearth, he drifts closer to a deep, hypnotic sleep. Listen along as the boundaries between reality and dream blur in this peaceful journey toward the Black Forest. The Offering of Bread. Lukas stepped into the kitchen mid-stride, the sourdough crust clutched in his palm like a precious stone. The air here was a thick, edible blanket of warm pine resin and the spicy, clove-heavy scent of lebkuchen cooling on the racks. It was the kind of smell that didn't just sit in the nose but settled in the marrow, pulling the tension out of his shoulders. He didn't look at the clock. In this house, time was measured by the cooling of the stove and the deepening amber of the shadows in the corners. He headed straight for the spirit corner, his bare feet finding the familiar, cool dip in the floorboards that signaled the transition from the communal heart of the home to the quiet edge of the unseen. He never made it halfway. With a sudden, fluid motion, Mimi launched herself from the top of the Cachalofen tiles, landing with a soft thud directly across the narrow hallway. She didn't just sit, she dissolved, flopping onto her side in a slow, luxurious stretch that extended every claw and every inch of her tortoiseshell frame. She became a furry barricade, her belly exposed to the ceiling, effectively blocking the path to the saucer. Lukas froze, his toes curling against the wood. He knew the law of the hallway. One does not rush a stretching cat, lest the rhythm of the house be disrupted by an act of impatience. Lukas stood still, his fingers unconsciously rubbing the soft, brushed cotton of his pajama sleeve. He watched the rhythmic rise and fall of Mimi's flanks, waiting for the signal. The cat didn't move for a long minute, her eyes half closed in a state of absolute contentment. Then, with a deliberate slowness, Mimi shifted her gaze toward him and delivered a single, heavy blink. It was a slow-motion shudder, a silent grant of permission. Only then did Lukas carefully lift his leg, stepping over the feline anchor with a precision that felt like a dance, mindful not to disturb the precise temperature of the tiles she had just vacated. From the periphery, a sharp, rhythmic tapping sound echoed. Sora was leaning against the lime-washed wall, her posture a stark contrast to the soft edges of the room. She held a silver pocket watch in one hand, her thumb flicking the casing with a metal-sharp click-clack. Her head was tilted at a precise 45-degree angle, her eyes tracking Lukas's movement, not with curiosity, but with the intensity of a surveyor mapping a coastline. To Sora, the spirit corner wasn't a place of reverence, it was a coordinate in a room, a variable that didn't fit into the clockwork logic she had brought with her from the city. "The trajectory is consistent," Sora said, her voice clipped and clear, cutting through the pine-scented haze. "You approach the saucer at exactly the same angle every evening. If there is a physical presence there, Lukas, it must have a fixed center of gravity. I've been calculating the displacement of air in that corner for 3 days, and yet the barometer remained stubbornly flat." She didn't move from the wall, but her gaze remained fixed on the empty space above the saucer, as if she could force the invisible to become visible through sheer analytical will. Lukas didn't answer. He didn't have the words to explain that the house didn't operate on displacement or barometers. He reached the small wooden saucer, a piece of hand-carved oak that had grown dark with age and oil. With a breathy, slow exhale, he lowered the sourdough crust onto the wood. The moment the bread touched the surface, the air in the kitchen shifted. It wasn't a wind or a draft, but a sudden change in pressure, like the feeling in the ears just before a summer storm breaks. The room seemed to exhale, a heavy, invisible weight lifting from the corners, replaced by a humming warmth that vibrated in the soles of his feet. "Precision is the difference between a gift and a nuisance," a voice sang out, melodic and rhythmic as a lullaby. Farrah entered the kitchen, her movements fluid and drifting. She didn't walk so much as flow around the furniture, her hands instinctively tidying an invisible speck of dust from the edge of the table as she passed. She stopped beside Lukas, her head tilting to mirror the angle of the saucer. Her eyes searched the perimeter of the offering with a keen, intuitive sharpness. "Remember, Lukas," Farrah whispered, her voice carrying a light, rhythmic cadence. "The spirits of the hearth are poets of the small. A crust placed too far to the left, or a piece that is too dry, can leave a room feeling cold for a week. They don't want a feast, they want the mindfulness of the gesture. If the balance is off, the house forgets how to hold the heat." She studied him with a soft, warning smile. The kind that suggested the spiritual equilibrium of the home rested entirely on the placement of a piece of bread. Lukas looked down and saw it. A single stray crumb had bounced off the saucer and landed on the dark wood of the floor. A cold spike of anxiety flared in his chest. To Sora, it was a piece of waste. To Farrah, it was a rupture in the domestic harmony. Lukas knelt quickly, his movements urgent but quiet, and brushed the crumb away with the side of his thumb, ensuring the floor was as pristine as a mirror. He felt the tension in his neck ease only when the surface was clear, the fear of an unbalanced house lingering like a chill in the air. As he stood up, a sudden, low-frequency thumping began to resonate through the floorboards. It wasn't a sound one heard with the ears, but rather a vibration felt in the joints of the ankles and the base of the spine. It was a deep, rhythmic pulse, like the beating of a giant, subterranean heart. The house spirits were acknowledging the gift. The vibration traveled up through the legs of the kitchen table, making the ceramic mugs rattle almost imperceptibly. Mimi, still sprawled in the hallway, let out a long, vibrating purr that synced perfectly with the thumping of the house, creating a harmonic chord of contentment that seemed to wrap the room in a physical embrace. Sora frowned, her finger tapping faster against her watch. A seismic anomaly, or perhaps a resonance frequency caused by the wind in the eaves, she murmured, though she stepped closer to the floor, her skepticism warring with a genuine clinical fascination. She knelt and pressed her palm to the wood, her brow furrowed as she tried to quantify the vibration into a number, a gear, or a spring. She was looking for a mechanism, while Lukas was simply feeling the welcome. Lukas turned his gaze toward the center of the kitchen, where a heavy iron tray held a mound of steaming Lebkuchen. The honey-gold cakes shimmered under the soft light, their scent now peaking in a rich, sugary crescendo. He felt the pull of the warmth, the promise of the evening's slow descent into sleep. But as he moved toward the tray, his eyes caught something in the periphery. Beneath the heavy oak door of the pantry, where the shadows were deepest, a flicker occurred. It wasn't a draft moving a curtain or a trick of the light. It was a distinct, elongated shadow, sliding silently across the floorboards, moving against the direction of the light source. He stopped, the warmth of the room suddenly feeling thin. The shadow didn't belong to Farrah, Sora, or Balthazar. It was too fluid, too narrow, and it moved with a predatory grace that didn't match the humming peace of the house. It vanished beneath the pantry door, just as the house spirit's vibration reached a crescendo and then faded into a profound, heavy silence. Lukas stood frozen, his hand still gripping the fabric of his pajamas, wondering if the offering of bread had invited something into the kitchen that didn't belong to the hearth. Place and the hum. Farrah was already humming, a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate the very air between the mahogany sideboards and the heavy velvet curtains. Her hands didn't just touch the furniture. They glided over the surfaces in sweeping, circular arcs, her fingertips barely grazing the polish. She didn't look at Lukas, but she tilted her head slightly, a silent signal for him to step forward and begin. In her hand, she held a stack of ivory lace cloths, each one smelling faintly of dried lavender and old sunlight, their edges intricate and fragile as frost on a windowpane. Lukas stepped into the flow of her movement, his bare feet feeling the lingering warmth of the floorboards. He took the first cloth, the fabric cool and slightly stiff against his palms. Farrah paused her humming for a split second, her voice dropping to a melodic whisper. "The grain, Lukas. Always the grain. If the lace fights the wood, the house will fight us. If the edges aren't aligned with the heartbeat of the oak, the hum becomes a scream, however quiet it may be." He knelt by the low coffee table, carefully laying the lace across the dark wood. He could feel the tension in the room, not a frightening tension, but a coiled energy, like a string on a cello tightened just before the bow touches it. He spent several minutes adjusting the cloth, shifting it by millimeters, watching how the white threads intersected with the deep brown veins of the timber. He remembered Balthazar telling him that a home was not a shell, but a living thing that breathed through its ornaments. He focused on the silence, trying to hear the invisible line where the wood ended and the spirit of the room began. "I fail to see the correlation," Sora interrupted, her voice cutting through the domestic hush like a scalpel. She was leaning against the doorframe, her thumb rhythmically tapping the glass of her pocket watch. "The acoustic properties of a room are determined by volume, surface materials, and the geometry of the walls. The idea that a few grams of cotton lace could alter the resonance frequency of a structural foundation is, by all measurable standards, impossible. It's a placebo, Lukas. You're aligning your mood, not the house." Farrah didn't look up, nor did she defend her practice with words. Instead, she drifted toward Lukas, her movements fluid and unhurried. She reached down and placed her hand lightly over his, guiding his fingers to the far corner of the lace. The cloth was skewed by a fraction of a degree, a tiny misalignment that looked insignificant to the eye, but felt like a snag in a sweater to the intuition. "Feel it," Farrah murmured, her voice a lullaby. "Don't think about the physics, Sora. Just feel the friction. As Lukas shifted the corner, sliding the lace into perfect alignment with the wood's grain, the air in the room suddenly shifted. It wasn't a sound that entered through the ears, but a warm, audible vibration that bloomed from the center of the floor and expanded outward. It was a deep, honeyed drone, a chord of absolute stability that seemed to synchronize the breathing of everyone in the room. The vibration climbed up Lukas's legs and settled in the center of his chest, a physical weight that pushed the remaining stress out of his shoulders. He let out a long, slow breath, his eyelids growing heavy as the hum wrapped around him like a weighted blanket. Across the room, Mimi had found a patch of sunlight on a thick wool pile rug. The cat began to knead the fabric, her paws moving in rhythmic, alternating pulses. Left, right, left, right. The soft thump-thump of her paws acted as a metronome for the house's humming, adding a layer of tactile percussion to the harmony. Mimi closed her eyes, her slow blinks matching the pulse of the vibration, her purr merging with the house until it was impossible to tell where the animal ended and the architecture began. Sora frowned, the precision of her expression wavering. She reached into her waistcoat pocket and produced a small, polished silver tuning fork. With a sharp strike against the heel of her hand, she held the vibrating metal prong toward the air, attempting to map the frequency of the hum. She leaned in, her eyes narrowing, trying to find the exact note the house was singing. But the moment the metal prong entered the field of the vibration, the frequency shifted. The hum didn't fight the fork, it simply flowed around it, sliding into a different, elusive key, the instant Sora tried to quantify it. The tuning fork grew silent, the metal dampened by an invisible force that refused to be measured. "It's shifting," Sora whispered, more to herself than to the others. She stepped closer, her clinical detachment replaced by a genuine, hungry curiosity. "It's reacting to the observation. That's not how resonance works. It's as if the house is avoiding the measurement." Farrah smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. She moved to the final piece of furniture, a small side table by the window where a single ceramic vase of dried heather sat. With a definitive, soft pat, she laid the final lace cloth, smoothing the edges with a lingering touch. The hum reached a peak of golden clarity, a resonant chord that felt like a physical embrace, signaling that the domestic circuitry was complete. "The house is balanced," Farrah announced, her voice blending perfectly with the drone. "The edges are true, the spirits are settled, and the night is open for sleep." Lukas leaned back against the wall, feeling a profound sense of safety. The world outside the cottage, the deep, dark mysteries of the Black Forest and the howling winds of the pines, felt 1,000 miles away. Here, inside the humming warmth, there was only the scent of lavender, the rhythmic kneading of Mimi's paws, and the soft, steady pulse of a home in equilibrium. He felt the pull of the bedroom, the promise of cool sheets and the heavy, dreamless sleep that only comes when the environment is in total harmony. But as the silence of the balanced house settled in, a sound erupted from the hallway that didn't belong in the symphony. It was a sharp, metal-sharp snap, a sound like a bone breaking or a heavy spring snapping under too much tension. It was a cold, jagged noise that sliced right through the warm drone of the house, leaving a ringing void in its wake. Lukas stiffened, the peace in his chest evaporating instantly. He looked toward the hallway, where the towering silhouette of the grandfather clock stood. The rhythmic, comforting tick-tock that had served as the heartbeat of the cottage for generations had vanished. In its place was a dead, heavy silence. The pendulum, which had swung with unwavering precision for decades, had stopped mid-arc, frozen in a skewed position. The clock had not merely wound down, it had been severed. The mechanical heart of the house silenced at the exact moment the spiritual balance had been achieved. The cello's cadence. Sora was already on his knees by the grandfather clock, the silver casing of his pocket watch catching the dim light as he held it an inch from the frozen pendulum. He wasn't looking at the mechanism so much as he was measuring the void it had left behind, his thumb clicking the stopwatch trigger in a rhythmic, desperate attempt to map the silence. He stared at the dial, then at the snapped spring, his brow furrowed in a way that made him look like he was trying to solve a mathematical equation written in a dead language. "It's an impossibility," Sora muttered, his voice clipped and tight. He shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under him. The tension on this mainspring is calculated to last a century without fatigue. For it to shear clean through at the exact moment the room reached a resonant frequency, it's not a coincidence, it's a mechanical contradiction. He reached out to touch the metal, but stopped just short, as if the clock had become a volatile object. "Leave the ghost of the gear alone, Sora." Balthazar's voice boomed from the center of the room. It was a sound like a cello played in a cathedral, deep and vibrating in the floorboards. The grandfather had not moved from his spot, but the sheer volume of his presence seemed to push Sora back from the clock. The heartbeat of the house has shifted. It hasn't stopped, it has simply changed its rhythm. Come now, the cachalofen is at its peak, and the tea is beginning to steep. The tiles are calling. Lukas felt the pull of the stove before he even moved. He drifted toward the cachalofen, the massive ceramic heater that anchored the room. As he settled onto the warm tiles, the heat didn't just touch his skin, it seeped through the fabric of his pajamas, sinking into his marrow. He felt his limbs grow heavy, a pleasant, leaden weight that made the simple act of sitting feel like sinking into a warm bath. He leaned his shoulder against the smooth, glazed surface, the scent of baked clay and old pine needles enveloping him. Mimi arrived a moment later, a blur of ginger fur that leaped onto the ledge of the stove with a soft thump. She didn't look at the humans. She simply collapsed into a liquid heap, her paws kneading the warm ceramic in slow, rhythmic pulses. The low, vibrating purr she emitted joined the ambient hum of the cottage, creating a layer of sonic warmth that made Lukas's eyelids flutter. He rubbed the sleeve of his pajamas, feeling the coarse cotton against his skin, and let out a long, slow breath. Balthazar took his place in the wooden rocking chair, the rhythmic creak-snap of the wood providing a metronome for the evening. He didn't start the story immediately. Instead, he let the silence settle, allowing the warmth of the stove to anchor them all. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't just fill the air, it wrapped around them like a heavy wool blanket, weaving through the spaces between them. "There was a time," Balthazar began, his voice looping in long, resonant waves, "when the forest did not speak in whispers, but in songs that could guide a traveler home or lead them into the heart of a mountain for 100 years. My own grandfather spoke of the great kinship, a pact made between the dwellers of the stone and the keepers of the hearth. It was a time when a house was not merely a shelter, but a living member of the family, breathing in time with the sleepers in the beds." Sora sat on the edge of the rug, his back straight, his pocket watch still gripped in his hand. He wasn't leaning into the warmth, he was maintaining a perimeter of analytical distance. His finger tapped a rapid, staccato beat against his knee, tap, 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 a frantic counterpoint to the slow, honeyed flow of Balthazar's narrative. He looked as though he were waiting for a flaw in the logic, a gap in the storytelling where he could insert a correction. But as Balthazar continued, describing the ancient forests where the trees grew in spirals to catch the moonlight, the rhythm of the voice began to exert a physical pressure. Lukas noticed it first in the shadows. The darkness in the corners of the room, usually static and heavy, began to sway. The silhouettes of the bookshelves and the high-backed chairs didn't flicker with the firelight. They drifted in a slow, tidal motion, pulsing in perfect synchronization with the cadence of Balthazar's speech. It was as if the room itself were breathing, the walls expanding and contracting with every syllable. Sora's tapping slowed. He didn't seem to realize it was happening, but the frantic staccato had evolved into a steady, lagging beat. He blinked, his gaze drifting from his watch to the swaying shadows. The precision of the clockmaker's apprentice was being eroded by the sheer sonic weight of the storytelling. His shoulders dropped an inch, then two, the tension leaking out of him as the cello-like resonance of Balthazar's voice smoothed over the jagged edges of his skepticism. "But the timeline is imprecise," Sora interrupted, though the clip in his voice had softened, sounding more like a question than a challenge. "You speak of these pacts as if they were legal contracts. Was there an era? A cultural migration that explains the overlap of these traditions in the Black Forest? If we can pin the origin to a century, we can determine if the hum is a geological anomaly or a linguistic leftover." Balthazar didn't stop the flow of his voice, but he paused, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of his eyes. He didn't answer the question with facts. Instead, he dropped his voice an octave, the sound becoming a low thrum that felt like it was vibrating in Lukas's very chest. The shift signaled a transition, a movement away from the world of dates and maps and into the realm of the timeless. "Time is a river that bends, Sora," Balthazar murmured, the sound almost a lullaby. "And in this cottage, the river has pooled into a lake. We are not counting seconds here, we are counting heartbeats. The story does not live in a century, it lives in the warmth of the tile and the scent of the tea." Lukas felt a wave of profound drowsiness wash over him. The sensory inputs merged, the golden glow of the embers in the cachalofen, the rhythmic purring of Mimi, and the enveloping drone of Balthazar's voice became a single, warm entity. He felt as though he were floating in a sea of amber. The world outside, the predatory shadows, the broken clock, the howling pines, felt like a dream he had had a long time ago. He leaned further into the heat of the stove, his muscles turning to water, his mind drifting into the looping currents of the tale. Suddenly, Balthazar stopped. The silence that followed was not the dead void of the broken clock, but a sharp, expectant stillness. The swaying shadows froze. Balthazar's eyes widened, his gaze shifting away from the group and toward the dark glass of the window. In the heady quiet, a sound emerged. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching, the sound of a dry nail dragging across glass. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a branch. It was deliberate, slow, and coming from something standing just on the other side of the pane, watching them in the warmth. The feathers of Frau Holm. Balthazar didn't move toward the window. He didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned back into the deep mahogany curve of his rocking chair, the wood giving a slow, rhythmic groan that seemed to answer the scratching on the glass. He didn't acknowledge the intruder with a shout or a shudder. He simply shifted the gear of his voice, sliding from the depths of history into a tone that was lighter, airier, as if he were exhaling a cloud of powdered sugar into the room. "There are those who knock," Balthazar murmured, his voice now a silk thread weaving through the sudden tension. "And there are those who merely wish to be reminded of the warmth, like the golden girl in the tales of Frau Holm, who found herself fallen through a trapdoor in the sky, landing in a world where the summer never ended and the air smelled of crushed clover and honey." As the words left his lips, the scratching stopped. The silence that rushed back into the room wasn't the vacuum of the broken clock, but a soft, expectant cushion. Lukas felt the shift in the air, a sudden velvet pressure that seemed to push the walls of the living room outward. The boundaries of the room began to blur, the edges of the cachelophene melting into the amber glow of the lamplight. He leaned closer to the tiles, the heat seeping through his pajamas and into his skin, but it no longer felt like mere temperature. It felt like a memory of a dream, a heavy, golden blanket that smelled of dried orange peel and old books. Farrah moved with a ghost-like fluidity, her fingers grazing the edge of a lace cloth on the side table. She didn't look at the window. She kept her gaze fixed on Balthazar, her head tilted, her breath sinking with the slow, looping cadence of his voice. She seemed to be braiding the air with her presence, ensuring that the sanctuary of the room remained sealed, even as the narrative began to pull them away from the physical world. "Frau Holm does not judge by the clock," Balthazar continued, his voice becoming a repetitive, hypnotic loop. "She judges by the diligence of the heart. And when she shakes her great bed, the feathers fly. White feathers, soft feathers, falling, 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 down through the gray sky, drifting through the pine needles, settling on the frozen lakes of the Black Forest, like a million tiny stars." Lukas closed his eyes. He could see them, not as images, but as feelings. The rhythmic repetition of Balthazar's voice acted like a pendulum, swinging back and forth, scrubbing away the residue of the day's anxiety. He felt a strange, cooling sensation contrast with the heat of the stove, a phantom breeze that tasted of static crackle and winter spruce. It was as if he were suspended between two worlds, the physical weight of his body against the ceramic tiles and a weightless, drifting sensation that pulled his consciousness upward. Beside him, Sora was unusually still. For the last hour, the cousin had been a creature of ticking mechanisms, his thumb constantly rubbing the smooth gold casing of his pocket watch, his mind clearly trying to calculate the frequency of the house's hum or the trajectory of the broken mainspring. But as Balthazar's voice descended into the looping description of the falling feathers, Sora's hand stopped moving. With a soft, metal-sharp click that sounded like a final punctuation mark, Sora closed his pocket watch. He didn't put it back in his pocket, he simply let it rest in his open palm, forgotten. The analytical tension in his jaw, the sharp line of his shoulders, dissolved. He leaned his head back against the plaster wall, his eyes half closing, his breath slowing to match the cello thrum of the story. The clockmaker, the man of gears and logic, had finally surrendered the need to measure the moment. He was no longer counting seconds, he was counting feathers. Mimi, sensing the shift in the room's vibration, let out a long, undulating chirp. She didn't stretch or knock over any of the small curios on the mantel. Instead, she circled 3 times on the warmest tile of the cachelophene and collapsed into a tight, vibrating ball of gray fur. Her purring intensified, shifting from a casual contentment to a deep, resonant frequency that synced perfectly with the low hum of Balthazar's voice. The cat became a living amplifier, broadcasting the hypnotic piece through the floorboards and into the very bones of the house. "The earth prepares for the long sleep," Balthazar droned, the phrase repeating with a slight variation in pitch, like a mantra. "The deep sleep of the earth, the deep sleep of the roots, the deep sleep of the stones." Lukas felt a sudden, profound heaviness settle over his limbs. It wasn't the heaviness of exhaustion, but a luxurious sinking feeling, as if he were being tucked into a bed of warm moss. He tried to shift his arm, to rub the fabric of his sleeve as he usually did, but he found he could no longer feel the weight of his own limbs. It was a floating sensation, a detachment from the physical. He felt as though he were dissolving into the amber light, becoming a part of the scent of the tea and the warmth of the tiles. He was no longer a boy in a cottage, he was a feather drifting slowly through a forest of silent pines. The cold air of the exterior world, which had felt threatening only moments ago, now felt like a distant, shimmering curtain of silver. The scratching at the window had been erased, replaced by the rhythmic, looping narrative that acted as a shield. The story was a wall of sound, a fortress of words that kept the darkness at bay not by fighting it, but by making it irrelevant. Farrah stepped closer to Lukas, her movements slow and melodic. She didn't speak, but she reached out and gently smoothed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. Her touch was light, barely there, yet it felt like an anchor, keeping him from drifting too far into the ether. She studied Balthazar and gave a small, knowing nod. The balance had been restored. The domestic magic was no longer fighting the broken clock, but bypassing it entirely, replacing mechanical time with the timelessness of a folk tale. Balthazar's voice dropped to a whisper, a sound so low it was almost a vibration in the chest. And when the feathers settle, the world is white. The world is still. The world is dreaming. Lukas felt his eyelids grow impossibly heavy. The golden glow of the embers in the cachalophon seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. He was floating in the feathers now, a sea of white softness that muffled every sound except the rhythmic, comforting drone of his grandfather's voice. He felt the boundaries of his self blurring, merging with the warmth of the room and the presence of his family. Just as the heaviness threatened to pull him completely under into a dreamless void, a sudden sharp pinge echoed through the room. It didn't come from the grandfather clock, which remained silent and dead. It came from the table where Sora's pocket watch lay. The gold casing had popped open on its own, the spring leaping out with a violent, sudden energy. Lukas blinked, the spell fracturing for a brief second. He looked over at Sora, who remained in a trance-like state, unaware that his prized instrument had just suffered the same fate as the house's great clock. But as Lukas looked past Sora toward the window, he saw something that hadn't been there before. A single, iridescent white feather was pressed against the outside of the glass, stuck there by the frost, vibrating slightly as if something on the other side was still breathing. The softness of cotton. The iridescent feather was still there, a sliver of moonlight trapped against the glass, but the world shifted the moment Farrah's hands touched his shoulders. The transition was not a snap, but a slow slide from the ethereal back into the heavy, honest weight of the room. Lukas felt the air return to his lungs in a long, shuddering exhale as Farrah guided him toward the wooden bench. There was no conversation, only the rhythmic slide of thick, brushed cotton as she helped him into his pajamas. The fabric was a heavy, ivory-colored weave that smelled of dried lavender and the faint, sharp tang of the iron. As the sleeves slid over his arms, the sensation was like being wrapped in a protective shell. The physical weight of the clothes acted as a grounding wire, pulling the drifting fragments of his consciousness back down from the pine forest dreams and anchoring them firmly in his skin. Farrah's movements were a choreography of quietude. She didn't just dress him, she smoothed the fabric over his shoulders with a precise downward pressure that seemed to iron out the remaining tremors of the evening's tension. Lukas leaned into her, his head drooping. He felt the rough texture of the cotton against his cheek, a tactile certainty that countered the strange, vibrating silence of the broken clocks. He rubbed the fabric of his sleeve between his thumb and forefinger, focusing on the tiny, irregular knots in the weave. It was a simple thing, a mundane thing, and it was the only thing that felt entirely true in a house where time had just decided to stop. "Steady now," Farrah whispered, her voice a melodic hum that mirrored the wind currently combing through the black pines outside. She didn't look at him, her eyes focused on the alignment of the pajama buttons, ensuring each one sat perfectly in its loop. "The world is still turning, Lukas, even if the gears have forgotten how. You are here, and you are warm, and that is the only geometry that matters tonight." Balthazar approached from the cachalophon, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the wide floorboards. He held a ceramic mug, the glaze a deep, mottled forest green that looked almost black in the dim light. As he handed the cup to Lukas, a plume of steam rose in a slow, spiraling ribbon, carrying the scent of honey and chamomile, laced with a sharp, medicinal note of valerian root. The heat of the mug seeped through Lucas's palms, a sudden, intense warmth that chased away the lingering chill of the iridescent feather's image. He held the cup with both hands, feeling the vibration of Balthazar's presence, a deep, cello-like resonance that seemed to emanate from the old man's very bones. "Drink slowly," Balthazar said, his voice humming in the small space between them. "Let the honey settle the spirit. The tea is a bridge, little one. It carries you from the noise of the day to the silence of the sleep." Lukas took a sip. The liquid was thick and syrupy, coating his throat in a layer of floral warmth. He watched Sora, who had drifted away from the wreckage of the pocket watch to stand by the window. Sora remained motionless, his silhouette a sharp, clipped line against the frosted glass. He wasn't tinkering now. He wasn't calculating the tension of the mainspring or the torque of the escapement. He was simply staring out into the void of the Black Forest, where the darkness was so absolute it seemed to press against the glass like a physical weight. "It doesn't make sense," Sora said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual analytical edge, sounding almost fragile. He didn't turn around. The synchronization of the failures, the simultaneous snap of two independent mechanisms. There is no mechanical catalyst for such a thing. No shared vibration, no atmospheric pressure shift that would target specifically the tension springs of two different makes. He paused, his finger tapping a rhythmic, nervous beat against his thigh. "And yet, the house, the hum. I can feel it in the floor. It's a frequency I can't map. It's unmeasurable." Lukas paused with the mug halfway to his lips. He studied Sora's rigid back and felt a strange surge of empathy. To Sora, the unmeasurable was a void, a failure of logic. But as Lukas looked around the room, at the glowing embers of the Kachella fen, the soft curve of Farrah's smile, the steady rock of Balthazar's chair, he realized that the void wasn't empty. It was full of everything that didn't need a gear to move. "Why does the silence feel like a blanket instead of a hole?" Lukas wondered. Sora is looking for a number, but the answer is a smell. It's the smell of the tea and the weight of the cotton. He's trying to solve the house like a puzzle, but the house isn't a puzzle. It's a breath. If he could just stop counting the seconds, he would hear the breath. He lingered by the Kachella, the radiating heat of the tiles tempting him to stay in the communal circle just a few minutes longer. The tiles were a deep, burnt sienna, still pulsing with the stored energy of the afternoon's fire. He could feel the warmth soaking into his socks, a slow migration of heat that made his limbs feel heavy and fluid. He wanted to sink right there, to become a part of the masonry, to exist in this golden amber of safety where the only requirement was to exist. Farrah stepped behind him, her touch a gentle nudge toward the hallway. "The warmth is waiting for you in the sheets, Lukas," she whispered, her voice rhythmic and low, echoing the cadence of the wind. "The tea has done its work, and the house has whispered its piece. It is time to let the day go." Lukas took a final, long sip of the tea, feeling the warmth travel in a slow wave from his throat, down through his chest, and all the way to his toes. The last remnants of the day's energy, the anxiety over the clock, the fear of the scratching at the window, evaporated, replaced by a profound, honeyed lethargy. He felt his eyelids drooping, the edges of his vision blurring into a soft, watercolor wash of browns and golds. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of Balthazar. The old man was leaning back in his chair, his open palms resting on his knees. He wasn't watching the clocks or the window, he was watching Lukas. There was a look of profound satisfaction on Balthazar's face, a quiet triumph in his eyes. It was the look of a craftsman who had just finished a delicate piece of work. The ritual of comfort was complete. The perimeter had been secured, the child had been grounded, and the sanctuary was sealed. Lukas walked down the narrow hallway, the floorboards cool beneath his feet, his footsteps muffled by the heavy cotton of his pajamas. The house felt different now, slower, as if it had exhaled and was now holding its breath. The silence was no longer a vacuum, but a presence, a thick velvet curtain that separated him from the wild, shivering forest outside. He reached the door to his bedroom and paused, his hand resting on the smooth, cold brass of the knob. He was just about to turn it when a sound stopped him cold. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the settling of the old timber. It was a muffled, rhythmic thumping coming from inside his bedroom, specifically from the depths of the heavy oak wardrobe in the corner. It was a slow, deliberate beat, thump, thump, pause, like a heart beating inside a wooden box. The final synchronization. Lukas didn't turn the knob immediately. He leaned his forehead against the cool brass, listening. Thump, thump, pause. It was a heavy sound, a dull impact of wood on wood that felt less like a noise and more like a pressure against his eardrums. He wondered if something had crawled inside the oak, some displaced forest thing that had bypassed Farrah's lace cloths and Balthazar's rituals. He gripped the handle, his knuckles white against the dim light of the hallway, and pushed the door open. The bedroom smelled of dried lavender and the faint, sharp tang of the old radiator. He crept toward the wardrobe, his pajama feet silent on the braided rug, while the thumping continued, steady and insistent, vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of his feet. He reached for the heavy carved doors of the wardrobe, the oak dark and smelling of beeswax. For a moment he hesitated, his hand hovering over the grain. He imagined a trapped bird, or perhaps a mechanical toy gone rogue, something Sora might have left behind in a fit of analytical curiosity. With a sharp intake of breath, he yanked the doors open. The hinges gave a high, thin whine, and the interior revealed itself in a sudden rush of scent, wool, cedar, and the starch of his Sunday shirts. There was nothing there. No creature, no machine, no intruder. Just the neat rows of his clothes, hanging like silent ghosts in the dark. He stepped closer, pressing his ear against the back panel of the wardrobe. The thumping was still there, but as he listened, he realized the sound wasn't coming from inside the box. It was coming from the house itself, a deep structural settling of the ancient beams reacting to the cooling night air. He focused on the rhythm, and as he did, he felt his own heart slowing down to match it. Thump, thump, pause. The house wasn't threatening him. It was breathing with him, a slow, wooden respiration that mirrored his own pulse until the two became a single, synchronized vibration. He backed away from the wardrobe, the tension draining from his shoulders in a long, slow exhale. He felt a strange sense of kinship with the timber, as if the cottage had been trying to tell him that it was tired too. He crossed the room to the bed, where the duvet had been turned down by Farrah earlier that evening. He slid beneath the sheets, the cotton initially cool and crisp against his skin, a sharp contrast to the lingering heat of the Kachelevan he had left behind in the living room. He lay there for a minute, staring up at the ceiling where the shadows of the pine branches outside danced in the moonlight, casting long, spindly fingers across the plaster. Slowly, the residual warmth of the room began to settle over him, a heavy, invisible blanket that seemed to press him deeper into the mattress, erasing the boundaries between his body and the bed. Just as he began to drift, a soft, weightless pressure landed on the mattress. Mimi had arrived. She didn't jump with a crash, but rather flowed onto the bed like a spill of liquid ink. She circled 3 times, her paws kneading the duvet with a rhythmic, focused intensity, creating small craters in the fabric. Finally, she collapsed at the foot of the bed, her body a warm, heavy anchor of fur and muscle. She began to purr, not a quiet sound, but a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the mattress and into Lukas's bones. It was a frequency that seemed to tune out the rest of the world, a physical manifestation of the home's coziness that acted as a tether, keeping him grounded in the safety of the room while his mind began to float. Beyond the walls, the wind picked up, whistling through the needles of the Black Forest pines. Earlier in the evening, the sound had felt like a question, or perhaps a warning, but now, filtered through the thick stone walls and the humming peace of the house, it sounded like a lullaby. It was a distant, muffled roar, the sound of 1,000 trees whispering secrets to one another in a language Lukas didn't understand but felt in the marrow of his teeth. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, imagining the forest as a great green sea that protected the cottage, shielding it from the rest of the world with a wall of fragrant, shivering needles. Then a new sound emerged, cutting through the wind. It was a rhythmic, metal-sharp click. Tick, tick, tick. The grandfather clock in the hallway had resumed its heartbeat. The silence that had plagued the house since the pendulum snapped was gone, replaced by a steady, unwavering cadence. Lukas listened intently, realizing that the clock wasn't just marking time, it was synchronizing the house. The tick of the clock, the purr of Mimi, and the slow thrum of the structural beams all merged into a single harmonic chord. He felt his own heartbeat slow further, sliding into the groove of the clock's rhythm. He was no longer an observer of the house's peace. He was a part of the mechanism, a small gear turning in a vast, invisible machine of comfort. His consciousness began to fray at the edges, the darkness of the room no longer feeling like an empty void, but like a soft, velvet curtain being drawn shut. He felt a sudden, vivid memory of the afternoon, the scent of warm pine needles, the golden light filtering through the lace, and the low, cello-like resonance of Balthazar's voice telling stories of distant lands. The memory acted as a bridge, a final golden thread leading him away from the waking world. He could almost hear Balthazar's humming, a sound that promised that everything was exactly where it should be, and that the perimeter of the sanctuary was absolute. As he sank deeper, the humming of the house reached a crescendo. It wasn't a loud sound, but a frequency of absolute peace that seemed to vibrate through the very atoms of the room. It felt as though the cottage were singing a song of welcome, a deep tissue vibration that smoothed out the remaining creases of his anxiety. The fear of the scratching at the window and the mystery of the broken watches felt like distant dreams, irrelevant fragments of a day that had already passed. He felt himself becoming weightless, his breath evening out into a slow, deep rhythm that mirrored the slow sway of the pines outside. Lukas closed his eyes for the final time, the darkness feeling inviting and warm, like a heavy cloak. He felt the presence of Farrah and Balthazar and Sora in the other rooms, their existence a soft, glowing perimeter of safety around him. He was small, and the forest was vast, but the house was a fortress of warmth. He let go of the last thread of awareness, vanishing into a dreamless, absolute dark, where the only thing that existed was the steady, rhythmic pulse of a home at rest. Just as the last flicker of consciousness vanished, the bedroom door creaked open a fraction of an inch. A sliver of light from the hallway cut across the rug, and a low, precise voice whispered into the silence. "I found the discrepancy in the gears," Sora murmured, his voice tight with a sudden, sharp realization.